Tomorrow, Yuri, when you want to mention a couple words about your film event.
Yeah, tomorrow is the Ukrainian Film Club event, and we will host the producer of a beautiful film about the damage inflicted by the war in Ukraine to the environment. The film is very beautifully shot without any human language in it. And the producer, Harriman, and the co-producer, Riabchuk, are going to be in person discussing the film with you. And also on the 12th of November, we, together with the School of Journalism and Frontline of PPS, are going to be hosting a screening and a panel discussion of the Ukraine's offer for Oscar's consideration. It's called 2,000 Meters to Andryczyk, with Oscar awarded several of the Chernov, and he's going to be in person there. So mark it in your calendar. This is going to be a big event.
And that's going to be at the journalism school.
At the school of journalism. Now we'll be announcing it.
Also, that's on the 12th. But this Friday, we have Women Writing War, a joint reading and conversation with Sasha Duglade and Oksana Maximchuk. That's at noon. And then next Tuesday, Volodymyr Kulik will be having a talk here. The title of his talk is One War, Two Displacements, Language Practices and Attitudes of Ukrainian IDPs and Refugees. So welcoming back Volodymyr. He taught a couple of courses here recently. But finally, we'll get to today's event, which I'm very excited to be hosting again. Our colleague, Mykola Riabchuk. Mykola's talk is entitled When the Soft Turns Hard, Cancel Culture Controversy During a Russian-Ukrainian War. Mykola is a principal research fellow at the Institute of Politics and Ethnic Studies in Kyiv, and currently a visiting researcher at George Washington University. He penned a dozen books translated into Polish, French, German, Serbian, and Hungarian, and was distinguished with several awards, most notably the Antonovich Prize, a very prestigious prize, the Benemerito Medal of the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Taras Shevchenko National Prize in Arts and Literature, also very prestigious. In 2014-18, he headed the Ukrainian Pen Center and chaired the jury of the Angelus International Literary Award. His latest books in English are Eastern Europe Since 1989, Between the Lucent Authoritarianism and Unconsolidated Democracy, which came out in 2020, and At the Fence of Metternich's Garden, Essays on Europe, Ukraine, and Europeanization. So please welcome Mykola.
Thank you, Mark, for this introduction and for inviting and for organizing all this event. And thank you, everybody, for coming, for your interest in remote countries. I believe it's very important to keep that country on your screen, on your mental screen, and not to forget about its existence. I'm going to cover a topic which contains very it's about controversy, but it contains also a controversial term, cancel culture. Some of you may question suitability of this term. Because of course it comes from different contexts and it's barely applicable to Ukraine. I use it for two reasons. Because it's used, regardless of my usage, whether I like it or not, it's used already. But the main reason, of course, I believe that to some extent, to some degree, it is applicable, and I should explain first of all why I believe it's applicable. Even though it absolutely refers to different phenomena in America, in the United States, in Ukraine. I believe that in both cases, what is in common here is that in both cases, this term signals some attempt of a marginalized group of underdogs to use symbolical power against the dominant group. So it's an attempt to fix kind of epistemic injustice. And in the case of Ukraine, of course, it's true. Ukraine used to be a subaltern group. And of course, we have a lot of examples of this epistemic injustice. And still, Ukraine Ukraine has a huge disadvantage in terms of in structural terms, which were created by history, historically. So, so in this case, of course, we can understand this desire, this intention, this attempt to fix epistemic injustice and to appeal to, first of all, to moral feelings. So it's not so much about about all kinds of bans of censorship, even though in some cases it's employed in Ukraine, for example, because we have war. Some things are banned. We don't import Russian books. You can bring them in private, but not purchase wholesale. Yeah, not for resale. Not for public advertising. So there are some restrictions, but first of all, it's we speak here about attempts to appeal to moral conscience, to moral feelings of other people, in order to find some sort of solidarity and support from other group to engage them in our problem. So in this regard, of course, I believe that this is justifiable to employ this term, and probably justifiable to use this appeals and to try to use this symbolic power by a disadvantaged group. So. Right. So I believe I explained already why I use this term, and of course we may have discussion, and it's not debated not only internationally but also domestically. Also, some people question the applicability of this term. But phenomenon, nonetheless, it has not only domestic, not only international dimension, but also it should be considered in a broader context of different measures introduced since the beginning of war, when many countries, not all of them, but at least this so-called first world countries, liberal democratic countries, they introduce a lot of punitive measures against the aggressor state. And these measures were introduced primarily in economy, political relations, diplomatic relations, and so on, but not so unanimously in culture. Even though, of course, there was suspension of some propagandistic films, where there was there were bans introduced on some very notorious figures who openly support Kremlin aggression and Kremlin regime. But still, controversy remains about whether how far this how far this restriction should go, how much we should apply of these restrictions. So I found a lot of arguments again, both for and against these restrictions. Probably the most persuasive arguments come from Ukrainian side, of course. Pavlo Kazarin, very famous publicist, argues that Russia, he explains why Russian culture should be not banned, but should be, I would say, for the time being, put aside, not to be advertised, not to be promoted. He argues that this, for two reasons, but first of all, because it detracts attention. It attracts attention to very, very nice cultural phenomena, and detracts attention from ongoing genocide, from ongoing killing, from ongoing rogue nature of Moscow regime. So this is his main argument, and I would say that these arguments are broadly shared by Ukrainian intellectuals. His quotations from Yuri Andryczyk, who also argues that that he goes in further, because he says that he also points out at some sort of lack of immunity in Western community against this, Russian penetration and Russian influence. That kind of hypnosis which is inflicted upon Western intellectuals. And he also draws very interesting parallel between terrorist character of the Moscow regime and international terrorists. In particular, he says about the difference between Taliban or ISIS or maybe Hamas and the Kremlin, because Kremlin has Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and Hamas does not have. So that's the main difference. But in both cases, both these regimes are outrageous. They are criminal. But they are treated differently, because Dostoevsky and Tchaikovsky, to some degree, to some extent, in some sense, excuse these crimes, or at least make us to forget, not to think about, not to speak about this. They introduce this formula, but yes, it's criminal, it's bad, it's wrong, but it's great culture. It produces nice, very important phenomena and so on. So this is argument which are basically broadly accepted in Ukraine and in many other countries and intellectual milieux, even though not unanimously. Even in Ukraine, for example, we have discussions about this. For example, in Ukraine, National Conservatory, highest music school, is still named after Tchaikovsky. There was a huge, big discussion about this, whether to rename it or to retain this name. And because the students and professors insisted on maintaining, keeping this title, this is still named after Tchaikovsky. So, as the argument was that Tchaikovsky did nothing bad. He was not imperial, even in his behavior and his mindset. So he's quite European person. Why should be punished, Tchaikovsky? Yes, it's not punishment for Tchaikovsky. That's what we have to understand. It's just temporary exclusion of some phenomena which potentially, which, as I mentioned already, detract attention from Russian political behavior, military behavior, but also which to some degree gentrifies this regime. That's the main problem, the main point. This, culture is employed by Moscow in order to embellish its very, very ugly behavior. This is a primary argument, and there is very interesting comparison between culture and sport, because also we know a lot about sport washing. There are quite extensive literature about so-called sport washing, because it's much older phenomenon. This today's discussion about Russian culture or canceling of Russian culture. Sport washing, of course, it's well-known phenomenon because it was used since at least for 1 century. We know about Nazi regime. We tried to use Olympic Games in order to gentrify and to promote himself. Not only it was not only about sport. This Olympic Games in Berlin in 1936 in absolutely anti-Semitic atmosphere, in the atmosphere of pogroms and so on. Nonetheless, it was broadly accepted by international community, and all major Western democracies participated in this show. And of course, Soviets are very famous or infamous in terms of employment of sport events for whitewashing, for gentrifying the regime. So it's nothing unusual. In sport, it's even more obvious, this hypocrisy, because in sport there is tradition of raising the flag. All sport events, they have the symbols, very clear symbols. So it's not like like in culture. Culture, you watch ballet, and there is no Russian flag and no symbols of Soviet Union or whatever. Even though it happens, for example, there was recently very loud scandal in Venice when Russian flag was raised during the festival in Venice. Even though officially Russia was not participant of the festival, it was excluded from the festival as a country, but nonetheless there were a couple of film directors with film teams which presented their films there, and there was a Russian flag which waved among other flags the entrance to Venice Film Festival. So flag is important. So that's another argument that we have to remember that in culture, like in sport, flag is waved. Culture is a kind of flag, and it's national flag. And it doesn't matter whether this flag is raised up because of the author, the artist is pro-regime or anti-regime. Nonetheless, it's Russian flag. Flag, which is raised up during the war, has symbolical meaning nonetheless. Anyway, it has symbolical meaning. But during the war, it has a particular symbolical meaning because it may may indicate some sort of solidarity with the aggressor state, with this rogue regime. So it's another reason to think twice whether to raise this flag during the war or not to raise it. Because whether you like it or not, it's a flag. It's culture. Culture indicates, it signals some, national belonging. We cannot forget it. We cannot ignore it. It's about national belonging. It's about culture in general, national culture in general. So it's another problem. And here I brought a couple of quotations from analysis of use or misuse of this, symbolism in sport events. But basically, these arguments are largely applicable also to cultural events. Maybe except for the third one, because in cultures there are not so many mass events like in sport, which are very emotional and very inflammatory. Maybe some theater performances or maybe some concerts may be compared to sport events of this kind. But generally, other similarities are rather significant. Specifically, this small usage or misuse of sport or culture as a smoke screen to hide some real events, more important events like today's genocidal war carried out in Ukraine. And also, a second argument refers to lending credibility to the aggressor state. Because if this country can produce such a great culture, probably it deserves some more attention, more respect, more credibility. Personally, I believe I largely support this tendency toward suspense of cultural events, or promotion of cultural artifacts produced by Russian authors, regardless of their political views and regardless of time when they work. Of course, people who are openly imperialistic, who openly support the war or imperial policy, of course, it's unquestionable. Of course, they should be excluded. But as to other persons and events and works, I believe, of course, there is no universal formula. I believe that each case should be considered separately, should be decided on a case-to-case basis. But general idea is to abstain from this, from promotion. So it's not so much about ban, but it's primarily about restriction on promotion. So it's not about to exclusion of bands from libraries or from collections, film collections or whatever. It's just about for temporary freezing of promotion of specific cultural works. There are a lot of a lot of books which are not translated from different countries, different languages. There are a lot of plays which are not staged in the theaters, also from different cultures, different, not necessarily from Ukraine, from many countries, and so on. So there is a window of opportunity to get better acquainted with this underestimated and less known cultures and works and films and plays and whatever. So why not to do this? Why not to temporarily to place Russian cultural products into the fridge, not to ban them, not to, basically culture cannot be banned, cannot be excluded, but promotion can be suspended for some time. That's the point. So it's not about censorship. Actually, there are no legal measures. Not about legal acts which ban this or that. It's just about appeal to some moral conscience of cultural entrepreneurs, publishers, editors, translators. So please don't do it now, because there is a war, there is genocidal war, and culture is Russian culture is used as a flag to gentrify the regime, to embellish the regime, to detract our attention from what they are doing. In fact, they just shift debate, shift discussion from crimes, from Bucha and Mariupol to new performances of Bolshoi theater, new exhibitions of some really good artists, etc. That's what the story is about. So I agree that there is no soft power during the war. I agree that yes, culture is a soft power, but during the war it tends to become harsh power, hard power. Because it's employed by the regime in this way. There is a long tradition of employment of culture in this way by authoritarian regime. So for Western people, it might be difficult to understand because in the West, culture was not etatized so much as in Russia and the Soviet Union, where it was part of it was like church in Russia. It was part of state machine, a kind of ministry of church, yeah, ministry of culture. It was a state-run institution, and of course, it plays very important role from the point of view of regime, and they did their best to employ culture for propagandistic purposes as a symbolical tool. And here I like to quote very I would say very graphic quotation from one of leading cultural figures in today's Russia, who very close ally of Mr. Putin, his longtime ally from St. Petersburg, the director of Hermitage, Mr. Mikhail Petrovsky, who in one of his interview 2 years ago put openly. And I like this quotation very much because it says much more than I can say about the essence of culture as a weapon, as a harsh power. In his interviews, he boasted about successes of exhibitions organized by Hermitage, exported abroad, and he said literally, "Our recent exhibitions abroad are just a powerful cultural offensive. If you want, it is a kind of special operation, not a bad special operation, which a lot of people don't like, but we are coming, and no one can be allowed to interfere with our offense." That's a very sincere confession, very talkative, very significant, very important, very indicative, because he said everything. He and these people, they clearly understand culture as a weapon. But instrument of special operation. He does not hesitate to use this heavily compromised term of special operation, which is just euphemism for Russian war in Ukraine. And he openly says this. Even though, by the way, Hermitage, it's a museum of foreign art, basically. It's not about Russian art, about collection of Russian art. But nonetheless, it's run abroad, all this exhibition run under the Russian flag. It's about Russian flag. Because we have this association with Hermitage. Oh yes, of course, it's St. Petersburg, it's Russia. It's great Russian culture, great Russian collection. So I believe that in this case, we have to trust Mr. Petrovsky. He knows what he says. It's absolutely sincere statement, and should be careful, I guess. There are several rather anecdotal examples of how culture is employed by the regime. It's really famous Putin's speech at the opening of Pushkin monument, and I like this picture in particular because it was staged in Kherson region in order to persuade people that Kherson used to be Russian all the time, since times immemorial. And Pushkin is employed here in order to just to legitimize this occupation of Kherson and incorporation into Russia. So Pushkin is the victim, of course, of the regime. But nonetheless, his name, his quotations are used basically for very dirty purposes. And of course, it's a replica of a cartoonist, which is not so senseless. And of course, it's more harsh replica by Ukrainian author. And another replica from Ukraine when war, because the war is, the term war is banned in Russia. You cannot speak about war, they speak about special operation. So Leo Tolstoy's novel is also renamed here according to censors' suggestion. It's not about the war, but special military operation and peace. But also, what is for me, what I like here is not only about this, joke about special integration, but also about gentrification of the regime. It's not only about today's employment of culture, but also to some degree also about Leo Tolstoy, who also, as Ella Thompson argued, did a lot in order to gentrify this regime, this empire. I would say that the main problem with Russian culture is not that it was imperialistic. Yes, it was, but all the cultures were imperialistic. 19th century, you can find a lot of imperialistic texts and artifacts and positions, of course, among cultural figures in France and United Kingdom and elsewhere. So it's not a big problem. Problem is that this imperialism is not exercised. It's not analyzed. It's not. Russian intellectuals did not come to terms with this phenomenon. It's not an issue, and this is fundamental difference because you can find a lot of deconstruction of colonial imperial text in France or in England or elsewhere. In America, there is attempt to reconsider the past in order to analyze, to come to terms with this problem. Nothing like this happened in Russia. It still is not an issue. Even entire regime authors, they avoid these topics. So with some minor exceptions, I can mention here Haji Murat, for example, which was published after Leo Tolstoy's death. There are some examples, but generally it was not an issue and is not an issue even today. That's the point. Of course, Ukrainian authors criticize very heavily. What I don't like in the text of my colleagues that they very often they manipulate literary text as they treat literary text as not literature, but as as some sort of direct statements, and they cherry pick some quotations and some motifs, some details from literature in order to show that this it's not humanistic, it's not sensitive, it's not just to compromise authors and personages. which is absolutely, I believe, it's not productive method, because you can find, you know, all these things in any literature. You can find negative personages. You can find authors which also are very, very questionable in their moral stances, their moral positions. So I believe it's not a method which should be employed to criticize any culture based with the help of this kind of arguments, referring to some, you know, misbehavior of personages or of the authors, or some misstatements. It's not a productive way. Again, I brought here several quotations of the kind, but I believe it's understandable what I'm talking about. I just draw attention to one quotation, which I believe is crucial here, because it explains the entire story, entire wrongs of such approach. This quotation from one critic or criticess. She wrote in the style of this criticism. She criticized Nabokov's novel, which is not very Russian, basically, or in particular. But nonetheless, she used this because it was very suitable for criticism, you know, because, you know, it's clear case of pedophilia and something like this. So of course it was a favorite motif, favorite topic for criticism. And she wrote very interesting things. She wrote that perhaps Nabokov's novel is the one that strikes the modern imagination the most. Literary subtlety aside, the essence of the matter is this: an adult man is fascinated by a child girl, experiencing both aesthetic and sexual attraction to her. So she uses this, you know, this kind of criticism to further to deconstruct not only Nabokov but several other authors to prove, you know, kind of immorality of this literature, this culture, something like this. It's a way to nowhere, I believe. You know, we should not go this way because actually, you know, because literary subtlety is the essence of art. So the art is primarily about literary subtlety, about, you know, it's about the form, first of all, you know. So we cannot criticize work of art based on the content, because form is important. Sometimes it's much more important than text itself. The main problem with Russian culture and literature in general, of course, it's not the text. Text can be different, can be deconstructed, of course, as any text, but silence about some topics. This is what I believe is crucial. There are a lot of topics, a lot of problems which are simply omitted. They remain absolutely blind and deaf to Russian imperialism, to colonization, to genocidal wars, extermination of all these people in Siberia and elsewhere. There is no reflection of this, neither in the literature nor cultural milieu, and that's the point. And this is what we can use for criticism. Not to talk not about what it says, but what it omits. It's more important, actually. And this profound difference between Russian culture and other imperial cultures, British or French or American. To sum up, first of all, I insist that the boycott of Russian cultural products and authors is not censorship, because it does not involve any legal mechanisms or bans or monitoring or punishment. It is based on merely verbal, moral, and psychological pressure on cultural actors, promoters, and entrepreneurs of cultural products, on appealing to their conscience, responsibility, and genuinely human solidarity with the people who are being subjected to genocide by the aggressor state. Secondly, culture is not an innocent, apolitical soft power, especially in the case of authoritarian regimes. because they take over all the sectors that should nominally belong to the sphere of civil society. These regimes instrumentalize and turn into weapons literally everything: culture, science, sport, religion, trade, and so on. And of course, you can see here the difference between censorship in Ukraine and censorship by Russia. Ukrainians, it was controversial decision of many local authorities to dismantle monuments to Pushkin in this case, some other authors, Russian authors. But dismantling was basically, I know, we can call it civilized, but it was rather peaceful, not like this slide. This was Russian cancel culture. How they can try to cancel Ukrainian culture. Skoda Museum in Kharkiv after Russian missile attack. That's quite different ways of cancellation. What is important? What we need to understand that culture in times of war objectively contributes to the aggressor state's military hard power, gentrifies its image, diverts attention from its crimes, and replaces, relatively speaking, talk of Bucha and Mariupol with applause for Tchaikovsky and Netrebko and Gergiev, etc. Culture, like sports, is a kind of flag that has a national character, regardless of the loyalty or disloyalty of a particular artist to the regime. Therefore, one should think twice about whether it is worth raising the flag of the aggressor state and waving it in the international arena at a time when innocent Ukrainian citizens are being killed every day under this very flag. There are several examples of this. As I mentioned, this story, a recent story from Venice, when Russian flag was waved among other flags, just because two Russian films were showed there. One of them was a propagandistic film, basically by Trofimova, called Russians in War, which was made probably under supervision with Russian authorities because she couldn't follow a battalion of Russian army in occupied territory without permission of authorities. Of course, it was agreed with authorities. It was part of contract. And by the way, in this film, she tries to show this, so-called ordinary Russians as normal people. So it's kind of normalization of the entire event, of the entire story. And of course, they say openly. She says openly there that there were no war crimes were observed. Yes, of course, probably not. Of course, she didn't have this goal to investigate war crimes. Of course, there is very good reason to consider such films, such products as attempts to normalize war crimes and to normalize behavior of war state and to normalize this state in general. So we can generalize this observation that the culture during the war is attempt at normalization of something which is not normal. Culture is a very powerful instrument of normalization, which allows us to forget about something else and to concentrate our attention on something nice and gentle and eternal. Two more points to conclude. Boycotting cultural products and figures is not, in fact, a cancellation because it does not prohibit or cancel the products themselves, but only imposes certain purely moral restrictions on their promotion and distribution. Moreover, only temporarily during the war, and in this sense, I like this quotation from by former Lithuanian Minister of Culture, who suggested just to put it in quarantine, to put into the fridge. It's not about the ban, about not complete rejection, but just temporary freezing, to keep it for some time, in quarantine. He considered this as a measure of moral and political hygiene and in extraordinary circumstances. And finally, the last point. Boycotting joint cultural events with good anti-regime Russians is probably also justified because such events create a false illusion of some kind of Russian-Ukrainian dialogue and even of understanding. While this is out of the question until the war and occupation are over. Another thing is personal communication, which is of course quite possible and probably even desirable. But it's private matter for anyone. It's up to you anybody to decide how far and how much to communicate in private. It's okay, but it's not. It shouldn't be public because all these meetings, joint presentations, of course, they may have some symbolical meaning. They may suggest something which is not possible during the war. It cannot happen during the war, actually. So that's another topic. I didn't touch it here in detail, but it's also part of this controversy about culture, cancellation culture. Whether to participate, to share the scene, to share the podiums with Russian colleagues. Obviously, not with pro-regime people. It's absolutely excluded. We cannot even talk about this or any joint ventures, joint meetings, joint common events. But even with anti-regime people, that's a problem. This is the topic of debate in Ukraine, and there were very heated debates. Actually, there was very remarkable cases as, for example, Andryczyk was very, I believe, unjustifiably criticized from my point of view because he took part in some, round table, not in some debate in Norway with Shishkin, who is they are well acquainted for a long time, and of course Shishkin is quite a positive personage from my point of view. But nonetheless, in Ukraine, it was perceived as some sort of betrayal, some sort of, kind of collaboration with them. Of course not. And Andryczyk responded very, I believe, very patiently and aptly. He says that, it depends on you. If you feel that you can debate, can discuss effectively and efficiently, why not? Please do it, So probably he was right. He argues that he was very skillful. He had very huge experience of such this kind of debates, and generally he's very good in this. He employed very interesting argument in this discussion. He told us, that of course you may. It's like in sport, you may not show up and to get some, kind of technical defeat. But if you can fight, try to fight. So it's probably reasonable. But of course, you cannot fight with Mr. Prokhanov or Prilepin or something like this, because these people are simply not, probably should not appear in any event with these people. They should not. They are unacceptable. That's the point. So it's not a matter of debate whether you can discuss or not. Simply, these people should not exist in public space, in public media. But to discuss with Shishkin, why not? There was another attack on. Andrei Kurkov, for example, who also participated in some events with Masha Gessen. Well, Masha Gessen is quite a positive person. I don't see any problem with having some, public events with Masha Gessen. She's actually American, basically. Like Shishkin is Swiss author today. Or Sergei Lebedev, for example. I'm of very high opinion about Sergei Lebedev. Who, by the way, I remember when I was in jury of Angelus' award, he withdrew because the war began and his book was nominated to this award. And he asked himself to withdraw his book in order not to confuse, members of jury and the public. And so I believe it was a very, very honest gesture. He understood that in this time, in this situation, it's better not to keep low profile, not to contribute to debate and potentially to contribute to triumph of Russian literature, which, as I mentioned, it can be considered a flag. So this is, I believe, this position of honest people, and I respect these people, and I wouldn't mind to have good relations and dialogue with Sergei Levy or something like this, on people of this kind. But generally, we have to remember about symbolism. There is very long tradition of putting Ukrainians and Russians in one bag. This Eastern Slavs. Of course, you fight, but you are the same. We are very close. We are proximate. You have 1,000-year-old common history. No, it's not true. Even if we have some common, it's very controversial history. But generally, even history was not common for most time. There were maybe 3 centuries of common history, but not more, not 1,000. But it's another matter. I'm not going to bother you with historical lectures like Mr. Putin versus Mr. Trump. Okay, I will stop here, and I would gladly answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Mykola. I'm sure we have lots of questions for our speaker today, so please maybe raise your hands and we'll get to you. Okay, first thing.
Yeah, thank you very much for the speech. It's very interesting and important, I think, because the topic is really controversial. And I felt like, first of all, I wanted to add a little bit, because I have some experience working, promoting Ukrainian culture in the country in which Russian culture is very much popularized. I work in Italy for Ukrainian NGO for more than a year, so it was like a battle. It was difficult. And you mentioned that just having, I don't know, hosting some events or artists from Russia, it switches attention from Bucha. But I also wanted to add that sometimes and quite often culture is, even though it seems like it's just the organization which focuses on Dostoevsky and Pushkin, they do focus in the majority of time on Dostoevsky and Pushkin, and then from nowhere in the Italian city comes from Russian cultural house the exhibition about people from Mariupol which waited for Russians to come and how good the city lives now. So it's kind of interconnected, and I think it's also it's even not just to put aside, but it's also the security and propaganda issues. So it's kind of also important, just from my experience. And I got 2 questions, if I may. So first, you mentioned that the most important, the crucial factor is the silence by Russian artists, and I just wanted to clarify: is it about the silence about the war? So the artists, they just continue being artists and ignoring the war which is happening now and in which Russia is the aggressor, or it's about just the historical emphasizing some issues while ignoring others. The example is Vogon, so a very famous Russian writing Russian. The majority of people in the world don't even know that he's Ukrainian, and there is a statue in Rome, in the center of Rome, but they never mentioned that he was Ukrainian.
Yeah.
And the second question is are there any instruments or measures available to after the Russian culture is coming from being put aside,
from the fridge.
From the fridge, to differentiate propagandic products and just cultural Russian products, since they are very much interconnected, and I think it's difficult, especially for international community.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for mentioning Italy here, because it's a very problematic country indeed. They are very proud to be a very cultured nation, and they prioritize culture, and they like to argue that culture is much more important than all these political things and so on. Well, yes, as long as you are not bombed every day and your nation is an object of genocidal intention, it should be wiped out. It's open policy of Moscow. They don't hide it, actually. They say that Ukraine should be eliminated. So yeah, Italy is problematic, and I believe this, occurrence in Venice was not incidental. So many more events like this in Italy, especially in Italy. Paradoxically, even less in France, because in France there is strong opposition against it. They're also very susceptible to Russian influence, but there is also some resistance. But in regard to your question, I would say that when I told about silence, of course, I meant both silence about the war and silence about history of colonialism and imperialism. I believe this interrelated and interconnected phenomenon, because if you touch one issue, of course, you would inevitably come to the other issue, and vice versa. And they refrain from both of them. Even today's critics of the regime, they basically avoid to say about Russia as empire, multi-ethnic empire, about today's Russia, but also about historical conquest and about historical subjugation of all these people and the dominance and so on. So it's not matter of intellectual reflection, either in culture or in general intellectual milieu. This is a problem. I believe it's the root of problem, because as Lebedev argued in one of his articles, we cannot speak about nice Russia of the future unless we make order with this ugly Russia of the past, and they are not going to make to make order with this, to discuss this issue. That's complicates the future of the country. As to coming back from the fridge or from quarantine, of course, it should happen sooner or later, and because it's not about crossing off. We cannot do this actually, even if we would like to. But what should be done, I believe we have to reconsider the entire canon and to deconstruct these imperialistic and colonialist motifs in literature and culture. Because it's usually omitted and never mentioned. And very few. You wouldn't find much references to. You can read a lot about Dostoevsky as a great writer, but much more unusual thing is references to his xenophobia, anti-Semitism, his very aggressive imperialism. In particular, his diaries. It's really terrible. It should be mentioned. You cannot detach geniality from this ugliness. And not only Dostoevsky, all these authors. So I believe that this canon should be revised, and the text should be also commented in more flexible way and broader way, contextualized. So that's.
Thank you.
Alex, and then back there, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why you're saying these two strands of your argument are interrelated. There's a logic to that. However, in terms of the actual logics of international community action and standards and thresholds, seems to me support for the war is the only defensible one, right? If you start excluding Russian nationals and athletes on the basis of what has been omitted from their culture, that's just not a defensible set of criteria, right? On its own, there's sort of exclusion. So it comes to the war. And I'll just go to your last slide, and I enjoyed the talk very much. I think you make the case quite persuasively. I do want to push you on your last slide, because I think the debate certainly in 2023 was on good Russians, but I think it's evolved significantly to not good Russians, but neutrality. What are the standards for neutrality? What are the ways of operationalizing it? The IOC, of course, in March 2023, came out with very specific criteria. What constituted a neutral Russian athlete, right? That no public statements for the war, right? No sort of social media posts, competing without a flag, right? The whole kind of thing. And then you had, Ukrainian civil society build campaigns around that, right? Trying to catch Russian athletes in violations of this. So I think, this kind of good Russian thing, I think, is a little bit of a trope, right? I mean, to me, the the really tough part is what constitutes neutrality? Is it operational? Right? Can it be sort of sustained when stigmatization that we've had here sort of starts to wane? That seems to me the more kind of like the crux of the matter in terms of, you know, allowing individual Russian athletes or cultural performers to be in international.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I can understand this, notion of neutrality if we talk about Russians who live in Russia. Probably they have no much choice, either to go to prison or to keep low profile, to maintain neutrality. So it's basically understandable. It's like under Stalinism. You couldn't afford much of civic activity, civic engagement. The regime is very similar basically today. But of course, neutrality among emigre authors, it's quite dubious and a questionable issue. What kind of neutrality? When it's like, to talk about neutrality during Second World War and during Holocaust or something. Well, there's no neutrality. You have to take some positions, take stance. It's a very similar situation. It's about extermination of the entire nation. Just don't trick yourself. You have to understand what the war is about. It's not about some territory, Donbass, neutrality, NATO, and all this blah blah. No, it's about extinguishing of Ukraine as a nation, as a state. They say it. Just read what Putin says and what his propagandists say. It's, I still cannot understand how 3 years, Western people cannot understand the essence of this war. It's about the elimination of Ukraine, not about, neutrality, finlandization. Well, no, it's just not an issue. It's not real issue. So, of course, in this case, I don't accept any kind of neutrality. If you live in a free country and pretend to be neutral, well, sorry, it's kind of appeasement. So, of course, it's very, very ambiguous term, good Russians, because in Ukraine since 2023, as you mentioned reasonably, as you remarked, it's a kind of maybe not dirty word, but very sarcastic word. It's employed хороший русский, хорру. It's cut to syllabus, хорру. It's not great thing. It's sarcastic formula. Even though basically I don't think that it's completely non-existent phenomenon. Yes, it does exist, but we should probably to have more detailed approach, or more. Not everybody who lives abroad and criticize Putin is horror. It's not necessarily. Many of these emigres are quite imperialistic people, and
I accept that. I just think it's sleight of hand. I think it's much easier to sort of, look at an entire group of immigrants, say, okay, you're not good, because there's no such thing as being good, right? That's a much easier sort of threshold than to say your standards for neutrality are problematic or compromised or inconsistent. That's all.
yeah. Okay.
Yes, back here.
Yeah, two questions, Pete. Yeah, thank you for your talk. So you mentioned culture and literature, but what about language? And when I say language, I'm not referring to street signs or newspapers. I'm referring to teaching Russian as a second language in the high schools, elementary, gymnasium. And if the Russian is no longer taught as a second language, so my question would be, isn't that kind of silly? Because Russian is an international language. So you have more, like I was in Kyrgyzstan at the summertime, by myself without a smartphone. And if you count the locals who are unable to speak English, unless you happen to speak Kyrgyz, they're going to speak to you in Russian. Because Russian is an international language, whereas Kyrgyz is not. Unfortunately, I've never been to your country before, and I got the privilege of visiting, because I'm sure if I need a taxi, and if a taxi driver is unable to speak English, you can speak English, right? I mean, you know better than me, am I right?
Sure.
Second question I wanted to ask you, might be slightly different, but also on the subject of cancer. But this is one that's going to be a tough one. Is there any other subjects matters besides for Russia which might be canceled or not canceled but censored? I take this headline from the New York Times, November 26, 2023. Israel has killed more women and children than have been killed in Ukraine. Was I able to find that type of headline on the front cover of a Ukrainian newspaper? I think the answer is no, because many people see that then you have to explain to the Ukrainian people the double standard and their hypocrisy. America condemns Russia, and then they supply these cluster bombs to Israel to kill 1,000 children at one time. You understand? So this is, I'm not trying to book has been translated into Ukrainian.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. As to your first question about language, Russian is not forbidden in Ukraine. Basically, you still can use it. Moreover, I would say that there is kind of very ambivalent situation because it's excluded from official communication, which is justified by the war, and this explains that we should not use it during the war. It's the language of aggressor, enemy's language, so to say. But at the same time, it's counterbalanced by the fact that a lot of Russian speakers fight in Ukrainian army, and very honestly and very heroically. So it's also language of our defenders. And this is another argument which you may find in mass media, in social media. So we have two different arguments which look like contradictory, but they are not, because they belong to different realms, to different spheres. One of them is to official communication, where Russian is excluded, and the other one belong to private communication, non-official, where it's absolutely applicable and broadly used. My feeling is that it's kind of the future of coexistence of Ukrainian and Russian in Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, would be the only official language. It would dominate the country. It will be broadly used and would be mandatory everywhere, because it was the main problem until recently that people could live in Ukraine and not use it at all, ignore it and despise it. It was a challenge. There were some people who did it. As a Ukrainian, I could not be served in Ukraine all over the country in Ukrainian language. Even if I asked like somewhere in a restaurant or elsewhere, they refused. It was you were alien in your own country. That's one of results of the past policy. So of course it changed. Not now. It changed. Basically, began to change radically since 2014. Now I believe the issue is clear and it's done. But as a as a personal level, Russian is broadly used and will be used. I believe it would not disappear because there's too many people grew up and will continue to grow with Russian as a first language. So this reality, I can understand both tendencies, towards domination and increasing introduction of Ukrainian in all official spheres. This is where the state has power to do and has legitimate right to do, but do not interfere into private area. It's also quite European and democratic and liberal approach to just to distinguish these two different spheres of functioning. The second was about, as I understand, there is kind of censorship during the war anywhere. You cannot carry out of war. So of course there are some restrictions and some things that can be used, not be used. Even though I must say in Ukraine it's more about public opprobrium, about public criticism, not so much about government interference. Government usually these very rare exceptions interfere in whatever of this kind. In most cases, it's some sort of public reaction in mass media, in social media, and so on. So it's not so dangerous. I'm not afraid of this kind of censorship. Ukraine survived the periods of when there were real attempts to introduce censorship, especially under late Kuchma and under Yanukovych. But still, I believe it's a society which is quite resilient in this regard against any forms of censorship.
Mykola, you mentioned throughout your talk several examples of how culture is being exploited right? To whitewash war crimes and horrible things that are being done. And this kind of reminded me, because I think people want to think that there's something beyond politics. There's something sacred that's not touched by politics. And people in general, human nature wants to say that culture is this kind of sacred beast that's, pure. But it reminded me how, like, same way maybe people like to hear both sides of an argument and find a golden center, and how that is exploited by certain regimes that are good at doing things, like with, I think of the Russian channel RT, right? Kind of, a lot of people would say, well, I want to get another opinion, let's see, but it would be exploited where something would be said so far from the truth that people, this notion of truth was this golden center, but it really wasn't, because it was exploited. The human nature was exploited. And I think this is kind of what you're talking about with culture. People don't want to think that it can be used, even though it's readily admitted. But then you also showed your frustration why so many people have a hard time understanding what the war is about, in your opinion, that it is actually an attempt to erase Ukrainian identity. It's a genocidal war. What is the Ukrainian government not doing well enough to explain this to people? Because it is true, and you hear it, that it's about other things. This isn't what it's about. But people admit that they were caught off guard, but they still don't understand that the war is about Ukraine. So what can Ukrainian government do? Is it about pointing to proof that Ukrainian cultural things, institutions, monuments are being destroyed? A better job of proving that to the world, that this isn't being done because a missile missed its mark? Or is it also a need to kind of loop back and link it to things that were happening before the war, that have gone throughout the history, like you're saying, centuries of common world? Like, this isn't new. Is Ukraine doing a good enough job of doing that? But if not, is that why people are having such a hard time understanding that aspect of the war? Does that make sense? So what can they do that they're not doing?
I feel that we cannot expect too much from government initiatives, because of course government is quite weak, and Ukraine has incomparably smaller resources than Moscow has, and so it's one problem, resources invested in propaganda and whatever. But secondly, also it's a kind of inertia. It's not only a problem of today's resources, it's problem also of accumulated symbolical resources, structural disadvantages. This is actually why Ukrainians try to appeal to moral conscience, to find allies abroad by this moral appeal, because it's difficult to fight with much stronger enemy. So I don't think that government can do this here too much, but society maybe can do something by interconnection, by connecting with international partners. And of course, what Ukraine should do more actively is probably not to engage in any kind of counter propaganda, because we don't have resources to do this, to engage, and we cannot lie so unscrupulous as Moscow does. It's absolutely Ukraine is, for better or worse, it's kind of democracy. So everything can be criticized and questioned. But maybe should employ more irony, more humor, more laugh, just to ridicule all this propagandistic stuff which comes from Russia. Humor can be powerful if it is inventive, it is properly employed. It can just destroy all these propagandistic castles constructions.
Yeah, and that has been going on. A lot of Ukrainian culture in the last 3 years has been employing that. You're right. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think it is quite effective.
But it's a very long process, because the entire history is very beneficial for Moscow. They have huge advantage, because they are everywhere. They are present everywhere. Ukraine is nation from nowhere, as it was written not long ago in New York Review of Books. It was featured article, "Nowhere Nation," by Jack Matlock, from American ambassador in Moscow, of course. nowhere nation. So, you know, it's competition between nations which existed for 1,000 years, allegedly, which is absolutely fake, but it's perceived as 1,000-year-old nation, and nation from nowhere. So, yes, David and Goliath. It's really a challenge.
I have one question online, and Yuri had a question. In Ukraine, the issue with Tchaikovsky is that he is of Ukrainian heritage. His family roots are in Ukraine, and his great-grandfather, Fyodor Chaika, was a Ukrainian Cossack. This is yet another example of cultural appropriation by the Russians. This is why many in Ukraine want to leave the musical conservatory in his name.
Yeah, well, it's actually an argument which my wife also uses. She also very actively says that, you know, Tchaikovsky is ours. Well, she says Chekhov is ours and so on. So she has very Catholic approach to to heritage. I think that we should consider all these cases separately on the case-to-case basis. You know, so it largely depends on the context. Personally, I feel that of course we should incorporate as much as possible into Ukrainian culture with different caveats, with different explanations, of course, because it cannot be imported directly, without any comments and arguments. Gogol can be, for example, incorporated. I feel Gogol is absolutely suitable for Ukrainian history of Ukrainian culture, belonging to some, you know, pre-nationalistic period. Yeah, it's like Skovroda. It was historical period when modern nationalism did not emerge. There was still very ambiguous, very fluid national identity at that time. But Gogol is typical phenomenon of that period with this double or triple identity. So there's no problem involved. But Tchaikovsky is, of course, a more complicated issue. I believe that, of course, he can be considered in both cultural contexts. Specialists probably can find a lot of Ukrainian influences in his music. And generally, I feel we need this broad approach like Czechs have to Kafka, who still include him in all anthologies of Czech literature and Czech also. Why not? But again, during the war, it's more complicated. So during the war, we maybe should refrain, or at least to think twice. This is my main message is to think twice, you know. So maybe not to reject, you know, straightforwardly and immediately, but to think whether to calculate costs and benefits, whether we should, you know, publish this book or not, whether we should stage this play or not, to show this film or not. You know, all this. In each case, we have to calculate cost and benefits, whether it's harmful or whether benefits prevail, you know, or benefits for Russia or benefits for Ukraine. Because it's a war, it's about a war, it's about very serious things, you know, and culture is here an instrument, it's a kind of weapon.
Yeah, actually, one of the writers you mentioned today, Yuri Andryczyk, in the book I published with Penguin, Ukraine 22, he has an essay called Why Must It Be Ilyich? And he takes on Tchaikovsky and the naming of that. And of course, he does it with irony. So it touches on that. Okay, 1, 2, and 3.
Well, I commend you on addressing this subject and contextualizing it in a way that kind of changed my own approach to canceling Russian culture, because until now, I thought it was basically a weak rhetorical posture. It's much easier to stop talking about some things and engage with it in a way that dismantles it, deconstructs it, shows it, and kind of winning that way. But my first question is,
you can do one for now because we have three other questions.
Okay. How realistic is it to conduct any kind of assertive cultural policy on the part of Ukraine, given the fact that Ukrainian government is basically a Russian cultured government? The president, starting from the president all the way down to every minister, it's like saying, we want to cancel your culture. And the fact that, correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't heard President Zelensky pronounce a single time something in defense of the Ukrainian language in Ukraine. He did that at the Ukrainian Museum here in New York 2 years ago for special audience, Ukrainian diaspora,
Mhm.
but not in Ukraine. The language that people get killed for.
Yes.
But he found no time or no
Yeah.
necessity to defend the Ukrainian language and stuff like that. So it's a kind of a or a fool's errand in a way with that government.
Mhm.
And then another thing, there was an event here, and during the event, the Deputy Minister of Culture said that we need to return, quote, return to Ukrainian culture, Mikhail Bulgakov. I have like 5 more questions, but you know, I've been cancelled.
That's what lunch is for.
Okay, okay. As to Bulgakov, my response is very brief. Not now. Probably he could be included into maybe not in canon of Ukrainian culture, but it should be considered in Ukraine in history of Ukrainian culture. Because it's a phenomenon, very interesting phenomenon, quite typical phenomenon for history of Ukrainian culture. And actually, his brother reportedly wrote Ukrainian poetry, so it was not so simple family story. Generally, you know, family stories of these people, of these intellectuals in Ukraine, were very complicated. Some of them belong to different. To the same family, but to different cultures and different ideological paths. That's another matter. As to language, it's well, your remark is very apt. I'm really surprised how often people in the West talk about Ukraine nationalism, about Poroshenko as ultra-nationalist. You know, it's ridiculous because if you live in Ukraine, if you know these people, you know this elite. You know, Ukraine inherited Soviet elite because it was not changed much. You know, they incorporated some dissidents, but basically it was Soviet elite which ruled independent Ukraine for years, for decades. And their heirs are ruling Ukraine. So, of course, this elite was not anchored in Ukrainian culture. They had very limited knowledge of Ukrainian language. And of all 6 Ukrainian presidents, only Yushchenko spoke Ukrainian at home. Nobody else. You know, all these people are normal Russian-speaking folks. But at the same time, I believe there is some sort of ambivalence in Ukrainian identity, because even these people they have some commitment, some attachment to the country. Language is not the only marker. I understand that Zelensky, of course, he has some problem with his past because in his activity as an actor, he and his colleagues employed a lot of very dubious jokes about Ukraine, about Ukrainian language, and so they just say ridiculous. So of course, it's for him it's not so easy to roll back all this past. So probably he prefers not to touch it because very dangerous topic in regard of his provenance. But nonetheless, the fact that they feel possible and necessary to accept some kind of Ukrainian discourse, it can be considered opportunistic, but I feel it's something more. I feel here there is some more important, more significant phenomenon. For me, it's an indicator of this, profound ambiguity of Ukrainian society, which combined this, very heavy imperial influence, acceptance of dominant culture, but at the same time, some attachment to the land, to some traditions, to the local population. All the time, Ukrainians, regardless of the level of Russification, they felt that it's us, it's Muscovites, and it's us. I felt it as a child, when football fans chanted, "Baby Moskale," something like this, in Russian language, by the way. But when Dynamo Kyiv played with Moscow, that's absolutely, they knew that they were Moscow.
Even rhyme.
Yes. So it's more complicated. It's also black and white.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, 3 questions, so please be very quick. Nicholas, and then in the corner, then Mark.
I'll be quick. I don't know to ask so much a specific question, just as like the personal observation, like as a foreigner, someone trying Ukrainian or Russian, but someone who is interested still in the culture of both countries. And so, for example, I took a film course last year, and in this film course, we had to watch one of Balabano's films, Brat. And I watched the film. I read an article on it, criticizing the film and how it's used to like justify the invasion of Ukraine. And at the end of the article, it says something like, it was a bad movie when it came out. It's still a bad movie. My experience as a foreigner was that, what? It was an excellent article. I don't disagree with the article. It's actually a shame I see how this film can be used to justify the war. But my thing is that like before reading the article and after reading it, I still thought it was a good film. Separating it, out of its context, like if we're just looking at art for art's sake, I mean, is it possible to do that? Because although, and you mentioned at the beginning, cancel culture, it's different what's going on between Russia and Ukraine, and cancel culture as a term here. And that's what we kind of struggle with as like Americans is, okay, can you separate the art from the artist? Can you just look at it purely, out of its context, which, I did, and I still like the film, but.
Okay. Well, first of all, I believe that Balabanov is a very good film director. I like his early films very much. So some of his early films are really good films. Brat is basically talented film, but of course he, as a talented film director, he felt some sort of public mood, and he reflected this public mood, and he deliberately actually he confessed, he told in private to his friends that he just wanted to make something popular, something some very successful, yeah. So he knew how to do this. He reflected these public demands, what public needed at the time, and what ultimately Mr. Putin needed, because film is, from my point of view, film is dangerous not only because of this, Ukrainophobic motifs which are there, but primarily because it counter-opposes Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, so to say. Gesellschaft is not important. It does not exist actually. You cannot rely on the civil society and whatever. So this broad ties in society, close ties are important. These mafia styles are important. Close relations with brat, with close friends. It reflected, of course, I believe it reflected degradation of social ties in the country. It reflected mafiization of society, I believe. So in this regard, of course, film deserves attention, deserves analysis, and it's important as a cultural artifact. Despite the fact that, of course, it's very toxic, it's very harmful, and it was not incidentally, it was employed eventually by Russian propaganda, and it still is repeated and repeated on TV and etc. It became kind of a powerful tool, like Petrovsky said it, of special operation.
Okay, then Mark.
I had a comment about Tchaikovsky, but kind of now it's kind of late, but I still want to say this. So first of all, I'm a music historian, and to hear that Tchaikovsky is a Ukrainian composer is really seems so out of touch with how Westerners attribute nationality to composers. So, for example, Franz Liszt is Hungarian because he said he was Hungarian, he spoke German language and was born in Austria and so on. Tchaikovsky never said anything about being Ukrainian, but the problem is not what that should be try to make him somehow Ukrainian. The problem is what Russian government, the meaning of Tchaikovsky and his music that Russians are giving to him today. And you mentioned this very good quote was Russian officials saying, "We are coming to you with our culture," and so on. But there are very specific examples how they are coming. So one is performing Tchaikovsky's Fate Symphony on the ruins of Mariupol. So Russian orchestra with Georgiev conducting comes to Mariupol as a celebration of occupation. was still dead bodies lying in the city and proclaiming this is our city and let's celebrate it with Tchaikovsky's symphony. And they also did it in Aleppo actually, and also like you showed one billboard with Pushkin and his son, right? But this is so ubiquitous. Like every single city that Russians captured, they put Pushkin's or Tchaikovsky's portrait over Shevchenko, or just like everywhere to mark that they now own this territory. So it's not about even Ukrainians or anyone who is sympathetic to Ukrainian culture, like arguing, or let's not play Tchaikovsky, but this is like really we can argue about whether Tchaikovsky was imperial composer. That's also contested. There's research about that. But what they want to say was Tchaikovsky today. I think that's very important. I think I was one question.
That's fine. Very good. Thank you very much.
And Mark, do you have a question? Then you can answer the two of them.
Thank you very much, Paul, for the analysis of this phenomenon.
Yeah.
Really,
Okay.
gives a very balanced perspective. I agree with you in that you make it a serious phenomenon rather than motivation. My question is about the understanding of the concept of promotion. You're saying that we don't have to ban culture, but we should restrain promotion.
Great.
So one aspect is promotion where? I understand that one thing is promotion in Ukraine, another thing is promotion in Germany. Right? So do you see the difference here, or is it sort of irreversible? Another aspect is what does promotion include? Publication, staging, writing critical articles, teaching. The third aspect is what you mentioned in the end of the article. What about those authors, writers, composers, directors who directly oppose the regime, who state loudly their anti-Putin's position, who have been declared enemies of the state, etc., etc. So if they certainly are cut off any opportunities to publish their works in Russia, but the restraint on promotion cut their living opportunities in Europe, for example, where
Okay.
most of them
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I'm really glad that we have these two questions together because basically I can answer both of them in one response. I feel that in all these cases, of course, we cannot say anything definitely. As I mentioned already, we have just to think, to weigh pluses and minuses, advantages, disadvantages. So. Promotion, you ask about promotion, you ask about response. I believe that, if the theater director or whoever thinks that, this performance would not be raising Russian flag, would not be supportive for Russian propaganda. What I mean, we should not amplify efforts of Russian regime to weaponize culture, because as you mentioned, they try to weaponize everything: religion, sport, business, trade, whatever, and culture, of course, also. So the main idea is not to amplify these efforts. If the publisher or whoever or director can very firmly say this publication, this performance would not amplify but undermine these efforts. If they can find a way to undermine them by this publication, translation, staging or something, well, of course, yes, why not? If you can do this. But you have to be sure that you can do this, because otherwise it makes no sense to contribute to Putin's efforts to weaponize culture. That's what I mean.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you, Mykola, very much for a great talk and discussion. Thank you all for coming as well. Дякую.
Thank you. Yes. Дякую. Впоралися.
І прийдуть, скаже, що ти любиш, мені цікаво. Ту Penguin, то що я винен, есей. Там я вступ написав деякі речі, просто я говорю, там examples.